Although I'm a licensed professional counselor in the state of Texas, this podcast is not therapy and should not be used as therapeutic intervention. Many of the products and practices mentioned are for educational and informational purposes only. Should you need support, please seek appropriate, qualified, and licensed professionals. Hey y'all, welcome to Between a Hot Mess and a Therapist, the podcast where we navigate the murky waters between what society expects and what it means to truly live, embrace the messiness, the beautiful chaos of life, and celebrating the rebellion in the process. Whether you're a recent graduate, a seasoned therapist, or someone simply curious, there's something here for everyone. But before we dive in, make sure you join the Hot Mess Rebellion community where you can connect to other like-minded souls. I'm your host, Shauna Lovin, a seasoned therapist and wellness educator with a very rebellious spirit. So grab your favorite beverage, get comfortable, and let's dive into today's rebellion. Hey y'all, welcome to another episode of Between a Hot Mess and a Therapist. Today's episode, we are talking about transference. Okay, so this is one topic that we do not talk enough about, but it is one of the foundational concepts in therapy, in psychotherapy. It is also connected to the trajectory of treatment and how we work with our clients. It's connected to the relationship that we have with our clients and our colleagues, but yet we don't talk about it enough. So this came up for me like a couple weeks ago, maybe a few months ago now. As of this recording, I'm scrolling through Facebook and this topic actually comes up, but there's a particular one that they wanted to talk about and they were just kind of going back and forth. And this is in a clinicians group that I'm in. I'm pretty quiet in the group. I like to kind of just see what's going on to kind of keep up to date. Like what are some of the topics that are kind of happening? This one came up. And so I thought it'd be a good idea to kind of dive into it, kind of see if there are some things that I'm missing about it, and to be able to talk about it with my own associates. This is what makes a good supervisor. You got to talk about the things that are actually hard to talk about. So, transference is an unconscious redirection of clients' feelings, attitudes, expectations onto you, the therapist. It is also kind of coming from past experience and relationships that the client has had. So to put it on the other side, countertransference is when the therapist has their emotional reactions and responses that are typically come from the client. So you as the therapist are putting your emotions, thoughts, feelings, reactions onto your client. This comes up because it's typically an unresolved issue. It's a bias or something with your own personal history. So transference is when it comes from the client. Countertransference is when it comes from the therapist. Now, I know there's usually not a differentiation when we talk about the topic, but today I want to make sure that we put that in here because it changes how we work and do our work as therapists. So here is an example from for transference. So say you have a client who has experienced abandonment in childhood. They may actually project feelings of mistrust onto you, and then they perceive you as like untrustworthy or unreliable. So that is one example. On the flip side, a therapist who has experienced loss may find themselves feeling a little overly empathetic or overly, say, emotionally distant when working with clients when they're dealing with their own grief or they've had troubles with their own grief. Now, we've experienced countertransference and transference in like many different ways. And there's a list of there's different types, but we'll get to that in a second. So some other things to kind of think about when it comes to this topic is there's cultural transference. This is where the client's cultural backgrounds and societal norms are influencing how they basically participate, perceive, or have perceptions about therapy and the therapeutic process. So some examples would be like, I'm a Black therapist, African American therapist, and in the community, I'm not going to say all, this is not a blanket statement. But for a lot, if you grew up in the church and you were having some issues, where did you go to talk about those issues? You probably went to the pastor or whoever they had designated to talk about those issues. You probably didn't really talk about it within the family unless it was the matriarch of the family and you got grandma's advice. Like, that's what you did. If you are of Latin culture, a lot of times they don't talk about it outside of the house. If it comes outside of the house, then there's an issue. Like, just don't do that. For more Asian cultures, it's taboo to have any type of like mental health issues or to be seen less than. And so they don't talk about it either. And they actually think something's wrong with you if you try to bring it up and address and talk about it. So these are just like some cultural things that could come up, but then it's reflected on you and you have like your own thoughts and feelings about that. Another area that can come up for personal transference, and this is where as you unearth your client's emotions, expectations, the relationship dynamics that they have with past relationships, past therapists, it all kind of comes to the surface. And so now you have this place where you're trying to deal with what happens or what comes next because they're trying to figure out what happened before and you're trying to help them navigate through all of that. So there are several different types of transference, and there could be positive and negative. We typically only talk about the negative ones because that's really what comes up the most, like the mistrust, the resentment, all coming from past stuff. Now, I'm just going to put this caveat. We cannot change the past. We can only learn from it. We can apply what we learned to the future, and we can keep moving on. I know there are some caveats to that, but a lot of us are sitting way too long in the past and ruminating about the past when you can't fix that shit. Okay, moving on. So positive transference could be really a good thing because this is where, you're evoking your positive feelings. You are invoking trust. You have a healthy affection. And then there's the similarities or perceived similarities of positive experiences in therapy. And so that's kind of coming from both sides of the spectrum. So another one that came up is erotic transference. This is when the client develops a romantic or sexual feelings towards the therapist. Sometimes it's unconscious. Sometimes it's overtly just kind of like there. But again, they're unmet needs. They are experiencing some type of unmet needs. It's like when your client has experienced a lack of intimacy in the past relationships and they may develop romantic feelings towards you because they're seeking validation and closeness. Plain and simple. Nothing, The impact of this, though, is that there has to be clear boundaries. There has to be ethical considerations. in order to maintain like the healthy relationship between a therapist and a client. Another one that pops up is parental transference. This is when your client is basically being the parental figure, projecting feelings and expectations associated with that parental relationship that they had. And it's coming on to you as a therapist because a lot of times they're seeking to nurture, to guide, to some type of approval. And the impact that it has is that there's some level of client dependency on the therapist. Like they're looking to you to help with certain areas of their life. And again, clear boundaries are important here. And you have to encourage autonomy. This is a space where it can quickly go from one area to another. And this is another one that seems to be a little bit unspoken because as you are peeling back the onion with this client, you find out that there are these issues here and that the advice that you're giving or how you are working with your client tends to look more like a parental relationship to the client. So they're looking for, the answers again, nurturing, guidance, and approval. Another transference is sibling transference. Now, I didn't hear about this one until I was actually doing a little research. And this is where the therapist and where the client relates to the therapist as a peer, as a friend, as a sibling. And then they're projecting like whatever the dynamics or conflicts that they've had in previous sibling relationships, it gets projected onto the therapeutic relationship. And it's like y'all are homies, y'all are friends, it kind of feels like this is the client you could probably hang out with if they weren't your client. And so just be mindful that it has similar dynamics of any other relationships. There are the struggles, there's the validation they're looking for, there's looking for a type of relationship. These are all the types of things that they're looking for. It's an unmet need that clients are trying to find when we get the transference from them. Now, I've had clients in the past where it was a little questionable, like, what are you doing? And I've had to catch myself on how am I responding to the situations that they are presenting to me or how they are transferring their feelings onto me. And I've had to be really careful about how I reciprocate back in the relationship to maintain clear boundaries. Okay, so here are a couple of countertransference that come again from therapists. And so they could be positive and negative in nature. The same rules apply. Here are a couple that are specific to therapists. So over-identification is one. This is where your client's experiences, emotions, struggles, and blurring professional lines are compromised objectivity in therapy. So you've had a similar experience in your own life, and then you find yourselves like overly empathetic, overly emotionally, and you are like super invested in the client's story, and you are just struggling to maintain therapeutic distance. That's what happens. This leads to enmeshment when you do this. It leads to boundary violations. And it undermines the therapist's ability to provide objective and effective treatment. So there's that. Another one is avoidant countertransference. This is where you, as the therapist, you experience discomfort and aversion towards certain aspects of a client's presentation. And it leads to avoidance, disengagement of therapy, and it often triggers from like topics or behaviors that are, again, from your own unresolved issues. This is feeling uncomfortable and discussing certain topics again, like say addiction or like self-harm or other triggering feelings of anxiety and inadequacy. And then again, it leads to avoidance of the whole topic and deflection, meaning you got issues in this area and then you don't want to talk about it with your clients. So how are you going to help your clients when you don't want to talk about the issues? So this one kind of hinders the therapeutic process and it damages the therapeutic alliance. Another countertransference is called fusion. This one is a little bit interesting because this is the emotional enmeshment with a client and you losing objectivity and perspective in therapy, often resulting in boundary violations and compromising the therapeutic effectiveness. So, for example, this is when you may feel overwhelmed by the client's intense emotions or whatever they're struggling with, and then losing their sense of professional detachment and becoming overly involved in the client's life. I have actually, I think, found myself here before where I've had a client where they just had a lot going on, and in the midst of trying to help them kind of solve some of their own issues, there became kind of like blurred boundaries on what you could like do. But then it's also looking at like you're trying to be empathetic and you're trying to show the caring and all the things to help them through the process. But there was this piece over here where it was just a little bit too confusing. So this is where we have to have clear boundaries in order to maintain the relationship. And then having the ability to be able to just like cut it off if you needed to, and seeking support if you really had to do that. I didn't need to seek support for this particular one, but it was the awareness that and reflection that I had that there was something actually maybe happening in the relationship, and I caught it kind of early before it got like totally like out of hand. So there's that. We are, we may seem like, oh my goodness, transference, countertransference, it's only for new therapists. Nope, it's not. It happens to the best of us. We all have clients that stretch us and test our boundaries for sure. So the idea of this kind of comes from that we as therapists have to be aware, we have to reflect, we have to have some type of ongoing supervision to really navigate some of these complex issues that come up in therapy. We have to recognize and address any of these like kind of out of the ordinary dynamics. We know that they come up, but we have to be able to address them appropriately so that we can basically kind of like nip it in the bud and then maintain ethical treatment for our clients. What happens when we don't do that? We have like this negative, like therapeutic space. And what happens is that our own countertransference tends to take over. It's kind of like engaging, in this relationship, but who's in the driver's seat? Because you got something coming towards you, you got transference coming towards you got countertransference going towards a client. And if no one is taking charge of this, and we know our clients aren't really going to do that, but if no one is taking charge of this, then the relationship goes south pretty quickly. But a few ways to just basically manage this in particular, or this area topic, is harnessing supervision and consultation. You have to be in that constantly. You have to have people in a community that you tap into for that. And so that's why I'm actually glad to offer that to some of my graduating associates. We're going to be moving into more of a consultation space to kind of give them some of the things that they need as they transition too. I think I'm going to open the doors for other people or other clinicians that are on the more newer side, because we want to make sure that you are starting off on a good fit. And if you didn't have great supervision, I'm just saying, then this might be a good space to kind of learn and explore some new things. I'm just saying. We talked about supervision last week, so tune in. Another area where on how we can manage this is establishing and maintaining clear boundaries. I mean, in all of this, it's boundaries. Remember, boundaries are not for the other person. They're actually for you as the clinician, as the person, as the human being. It's you, your boundaries. It's the ones that you set and the ones that you maintain. And it looks different for everyone, but just be mindful of that. So some of the things that you have to be particularly super aware about on this one is setting limits on your self-disclosure. Now, I know as a whole, they say don't disclose anything in your therapeutic relationship, but I beg to differ, because sometimes when you disclose information, it's helpful to the client. They get to see that, one, you're human. 2, you've had similar experiences. And 3, they were able to get you as a therapist was able to get through and pass it. So that gives them maybe a vote of confidence that they can too. The other thing is maintaining confidentiality, as well as avoiding dual relationships. I'm going to say that again for the people in the back. Avoiding dual relationships. Now, there is a caveat to that, but for most of my therapists, y'all know y'all ain't supposed to be in relationships with people. You ain't supposed to be their friends. Well, I'm not going to be their friend, even though it says like 5 years, something like that, something crazy. But I'm not going to be friends. And you ain't supposed to be having sex with nobody. I'm just saying. And if you didn't know, I'm telling you now, that's in the rule book. Look it up, okay? So the caveat to dual relationships, though, is when you live in a rural community. And that's just because you're always going to cross paths with people that you may work with, you have worked with in the past, because the community is so small. Y'all go to the same church, y'all going to the county fair, y'all, going to the same grocery store. And it's hard to maintain dual relationships in that sense. I'm not saying, that y'all gonna be buddies. No, we're not saying that. But being mindful that if you live in a smaller community, that is technically a dual relationship. And so you have to learn to just kind of navigate what that looks like, in the therapeutic space. So an example of that would be is that, your kid is on the baseball team and you see one of your clients. Or you see, it could be a parent or a kid, whatever you work with, you see a client. They come up to you and say, hey, and they start talking to you. Yeah, you can acknowledge them and say hello and then kind of leave it at that. You can change the subject. You can walk away. There are things you can do to maintain that. But it's the fact that you're going to cross paths with this person because there was a therapeutic relationship somewhere in there before. Okay, so that was a little off topic. But the idea of transference and countertransference is just this thing that we have to navigate. We have to be aware that it happens, even to the best of us, but we have to learn to navigate it, to maintain our boundaries, to seek help when we really need to use it, be in consultation. So don't feel like just because you've had or have experiences that you've done something wrong, because you haven't. Again, this is one of those things where it's going to happen. It can happen today or it can happen in 20 years. So I hope somebody found this helpful today. Until next time, thanks for joining today's rebellion with me. Remember, it's okay to be a hot mess sometimes. It's all part of the journey. Until next time, stay rebellious, stay authentic, and keep embracing the beautiful messiness of life. Don't forget to join the Hot Mess Rebellion community, where you can connect with other like-minded souls. And anything mentioned in today's episode will be linked in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure you subscribe, you share with a friend, you leave a review, and you keep coming back for more. This podcast was brought to you by Healing Roots Wellness and Botanicals. For more information, please visit healingrootswab.com.